My name is Nicholas and I still don't know why I accepted that excursion. Maybe it was the need to escape from the routine, or maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I could face my fears. What I'm sure of is that I never imagined the trip would change my life forever. It was in the summer of 2007 when my group of friends and I decided to explore the forests near the Yaima volcano, located in the Araina region. We were looking for a different experience, something that would allow us to disconnect from the noise of the city and immerse ourselves in nature. There were 5 of us. Me, Andres, the improvised leader of the group, Valeria, who always carried a camera to document everything, Camila, our expert in maps and routes, and Felipe, who was more excited about the beers we were bringing than the hike itself. The forest welcomed us with imposing beauty. The centuries-old trees rose like silent giants, and the cold air carried the scent of resin and damp earth. It seemed like the perfect place for an adventure. When we arrived at the small town where we would start our excursion, we stopped at a small store to buy provisions. It was there that we met Don Esteban, an old man with eyes as dark as the shadow of the forest. While we were paying, he stared at us with a look of curiosity mixed with concern. "And where are you going?" he asked, crossing his arms. "We're going to explore the forest near the volcano," Andres replied enthusiastically. "We want to reach the oldest trees." Don Esteban shook his head and sighed. "You shouldn't go that far. There are places in that forest that aren't for you. Listen to my advice, stick to the marked routes." Valeria, always skeptical, shrugged. "What happens if we wander off a bit? Are we going to get lost?" "That would be the least of your problems, girl. What lies beyond the boundaries doesn't forgive those who dare to enter." His tone was so serious that even Felipe, who rarely took anything seriously, stopped joking. Don Esteban leaned toward us and lowered his voice. "The forest has a guardian. It's not human, but it's not an animal either. It's something you shouldn't see because if you do, you won't be the same." Andres, with his arrogance, smiled dismissively. "Don't worry, Don Esteban. We know how to take care of ourselves." The old man just shook his head and left us with one last warning. "If you see something strange, don't run, don't scream, and above all, don't look it in the eyes. It doesn't tolerate being challenged." Ignoring Don Esteban's words, we started our hike the next day. The first stretch was calm, and the forest seemed welcoming and almost magical. Valeria took pictures, and Camila guided us with precision along the marked paths. "There's nothing to worry about," said Andres, raising his arms. "It's just a forest." However, as we went deeper, the trail signs began to disappear. Camila checked her map several times, confused. "This doesn't make sense. We should be close to a clearing, but there's nothing here." "Maybe we're just a little off track," suggested Felipe, opening a can of beer. Soon we came across a small wooden sign stuck in the ground. It was weathered and covered in moss, but we could still read it. "Do not continue, dangerous terrain." Andres, ever the daredevil, decided to ignore it. "We're not stopping here just because of an old sign. Let's keep going." As we ventured beyond the sign, the atmosphere began to change. I can swear that the air became colder, and the silence, which had been present, grew deeper. We could no longer hear the distant chirping of birds or the creaking of branches beneath our feet. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. "Do you guys notice that everything's quieter?" asked Valeria, looking around. I nodded, although I didn't want to say it aloud. There was something about this place that made each step feel heavier. Camila, usually the calmest of us all, started to look uneasy. "This isn't right. We shouldn't be here." Andres, however, insisted on continuing, arguing that we couldn't give up so easily and that we were sure to find something amazing ahead. "Amazing like what?" Valeria asked, frustrated. "A sign that says happiness for being so stubborn?" Before Andres could answer, we heard a noise. It was a low, constant rumble that seemed to come from all directions. We stopped abruptly, trying to locate the source. "What was that?" Felipe asked in a tone he rarely used. It seemed like he was scared. No one responded, and we all stood frozen. The sound continued, growing closer. Then we saw it. At first I thought it was a fallen log, but when it moved I realized it was nothing natural. It was a grotesque, hunched figure with twisted limbs and a face that seemed like a mix of human and animal. Its eyes were the worst, small, sunken, and filled with silent hatred. It moved slowly through the shadows as if watching us. "That's the guardian," Valeria whispered, not taking her eyes off it. "Don't move," Andres ordered in a barely audible whisper. The creature stopped, and for a moment that seemed eternal, it stared at us. Then, without warning, it let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed throughout the forest. Felipe was the one who broke the spell. He screamed and started running, disappearing into the trees. The creature followed with a speed that seemed impossible for something so deformed. "Felipe." Camila cried, but Andres held her back. No, we can't follow him. We have to get out of here. The rest of us started running in the opposite direction. The creature was no longer in sight, but its screams still resonated. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The forest, which had once seemed like a labyrinth of tranquility, now felt like a nightmare. We ran blindly, desperately hoping to find the way back. But the forest seemed to play tricks on us. The trees all looked the same, and the paths that had been clear before were now covered in branches and leaves. We're never getting out, Valeria shouted, tears streaming down her face. Shut up. Andres snapped. We're getting out, just keep running. But deep inside, I knew we weren't alone. I could feel something following us, something that reveled in our fear. We ran aimlessly, each of us with the forest. Every step we took felt like we were being pursued by something monstrous, and the distant screams of our friends echoed through the trees, only adding to the horror of the moment. We kept running, dodging branches, not daring to look back. The forest had become a maze of fear, its beauty now replaced with a suffocating sense of dread. As we pushed through the underbrush, we stumbled upon another clearing, and there we saw something that we couldn't believe: Felipe. He was standing, trembling, his eyes wide with terror. He seemed to have lost all sense of reason, his face pale and covered in dirt. Felipe. I called out, but he didn't respond. He was staring at something beyond us, his eyes frozen in terror. Felipe, we need to go. But he couldn't hear us, or perhaps he didn't care. He was lost in the grip of fear. The creature's growls grew louder, and I could feel its presence getting closer. I grabbed Felipe's arm and tried to drag him, but he remained motionless, as if entranced by something invisible. We had no choice but to keep moving forward, leaving Felipe behind. We had to get out, we had to survive. The creature's presence was oppressive, and the terror that had gripped us was now palpable in every breath. The forest seemed endless, each turn offering no escape. The once peaceful place was now a nightmare, an unforgiving wilderness that would not let us go. We kept running, but with each step, the feeling that we were being watched intensified. The shadows themselves seemed to reach out for us. Then, just as we thought we could run no more, we saw it, a faint light in the distance. It could have been a trick of our exhausted minds, but it was the only hope we had left. We ran toward it, pushing our tired bodies to the limit, not daring to stop, not daring to look back. When we finally broke through the last line of trees, we found ourselves at the edge of the forest, with the town just beyond. We had made it. We collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, unable to process what had just happened. The forest behind us remained silent, as if it had swallowed everything up. But we knew better. We had escaped, but we knew something would never leave us. We had seen the Guardian, and it would always be with us, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next foolish group of travelers who would dare to enter the forest's cursed depths. I didn't know if we would make it, if we would escape, but I couldn't give up. Finally, we saw a light between the trees, a sign that we were close to the edge of the forest. We ran towards it with all our strength, not looking back. When we crossed the line of trees, the buzzing disappeared, the air became lighter, and the silence of the forest was replaced by the familiar sounds of nature. We collapsed to the ground, panting and trembling. Valeria appeared shortly after, pale, but Andres was not with her. Where is Andres? I asked, my heart in my throat. Valeria shook her head, unable to answer me. We sat on the ground, surrounded by the edge of the forest, trying to catch our breath. The absence of Andres was an unbearable weight. And although we wanted to go back for him, we knew that doing so meant facing the Guardian again. Valeria, with a tear-streaked face, hugged her knees, murmuring again and again, I shouldn't have followed him, I shouldn't have left him behind. Camila, although visibly affected, tried to stay calm. We need to go back to the village and get help. If we stay here, none of us will make it out alive. I agreed, but something inside me resisted leaving Andres in that forest. His face kept appearing in my mind, frozen in the moment we saw him stumble over the stones. We can't leave him there. We can't leave him there. I didn't know what had happened to Felipe either, I said, although my voice trembled more than I would have liked to admit. Camila looked at me intently. If we go back now, all we'll accomplish is that the Guardian will catch us all. Andres and Felipe knew what they were getting into. I didn't answer her. The words were too harsh, but they were still right. The walk back to the village was a torment. None of us spoke, and the weight of what had happened sank with each step. The landscape that had once seemed beautiful now felt oppressive. Every shadow, every crack of a branch made us turn our heads, fearful that the Guardian had followed us. When we reached the village, it seemed deserted. The few people we found looked at us cautiously, as if they knew what we had done. It was Don Esteban who greeted us, standing in front of his store with a somber expression. "I warned you," he said without a hint of surprise in his voice. "I told him not to go any further, that our friends Andres and Felipe were out there." "We have to find them," Valeria cried, breaking down. Don Esteban shook his head. "If they are out there, there's nothing you can do. The Guardian doesn't let those who break the rules leave." "But they're human," I cried out desperately. Finally, the old man sighed and pointed toward the horizon, where the shadows of the forest stretched out like a dark veil. "That place doesn't belong to the living. You crossed a line you shouldn't have. Now you can only accept the consequences." That night, Don Esteban allowed us to stay in his shop while the others tried to rest. I sat with him, searching for answers. "What is that, Guardian?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The old man took his time before answering. "It's not something that can be easily explained. The Imbunch, as we call it, is a creature that should not exist. The elders spoke of it as a punishment from the earth itself, a deformed being created to protect what is sacred." "Sacred?" I replied. "What's sacred about a place that protects illegal crops?" Don Esteban looked at me intently, and for the first time, I noticed a mix of shame and resignation on his face. He knew that we had seen the crops hidden in the forest. The forest had not always been a place of sin. Before those crops came, this land was sacred to our ancestors, but greed and fear led us to make a pact with that which we did not understand. The Imbunch protects these lands, but not for us. It protects what remains from the past, and if anyone challenges it, it ensures they pay the price. The next morning, Valeria couldn't bear it any longer. "I'm going to find Andres alone without you," she said while checking her gear. "That's crazy," Camila said, standing up. "If you go back to the forest, the only thing you'll find is disappearing like them." "I don't care," Valeria replied, her eyes filled with determination. "I can't stay here knowing they might still be alive." I couldn't let her go alone, even though I knew if we returned, it would almost certainly mean death. The guilt and fear of leaving Andres and Felipe behind were too much to ignore. Finally, Valeria and I decided to go back into the forest, while Camila stayed in the village, too scared to join us. The forest greeted us with the same oppressive air from before. The shadows seemed denser, and the silence even more unsettling. We walked for hours, following the path we remembered, but nothing seemed familiar. It was as if the forest had changed, as if it were playing with us. Finally, we reached the clearing, and the circle of stones was still there, but something had changed. The marks on the stones were glowing intensely, and inside the circle was someone. It was Andres. His body was there, but it wasn't the Andres we knew. His face was motionless, his eyes wide open and empty, as if the forest had absorbed his life, leaving only a shell behind. Valeria fell to her knees, crying, while I stood frozen, unable to move. It was then that we saw him. The Guardian was there, watching us from the edge of the clearing. His twisted figure and burning gaze were even more terrifying in the dim light of the circle. He didn't move, but his presence filled everything. "Let's go," I whispered, grabbing Valeria by the arm. "We can't do anything for him." She tried to resist, but finally she gave in. We backed away slowly, never taking our eyes off the Guardian. When we reached the edge of the clearing, he slightly inclined his head toward us as a final warning. When we returned to the village, Camila was waiting for us. Seeing our faces, she knew what had happened, but no one said a word. That same night, we decided to leave the area. We couldn't stay there knowing what had happened. Before we left, Don Esteban gave us one last piece of advice. "Don't talk about this to anyone. When the authorities come, we'll take care of them. The forest doesn't forget, and if you keep drawing its attention, one day, it might come looking for you." We reported both Felipe and Andres as missing. Of course, there was a search, although I believe it was handled by the nearby village inhabitants. Their families hate us, they think we did something to them. Years later, I still dream about that forest. Sometimes I see the trees rising like silent guardians, and other times, I see the twisted figure of the Imbunch watching from the shadows. I don't know if we'll ever be able to forget what we experienced there, but there's one thing I know for sure. We should never have crossed that line.